London, 1878. A Victorian nursery. Gas lamps flicker against wallpaper. A mother sits beside her children's bed, reading from a new translation of the brothers Grimm. The tale is Hansel and Gretel, two children abandoned in a dark forest by parents too poor to feed them. A witch who fattens children in cages, preparing to cook and eat them. An oven where the witch burns alive, screaming. The mother closes the book. The children lie in darkness, thinking about forests and witches and ovens. And outside this comfortable nursery, in the real Victorian London surrounding them, other children are genuinely abandoned, left in workhouses by desperate parents, sold to strangers who will kill them for profit, exploited in factories and mines where their small bodies are consumed by labour as surely as any witch's oven consumes flesh. The fairy tale the mother just read is not escapist fantasy. It is uncomfortably close to reality. Perhaps that is why it terrifies. Victorian children listening to stories about abandonment and cannibalism know, somewhere deep in their bones, that the real world offers horrors equally dark. That forests and witches are not the only dangers. That their own society practices cruelties the tales only symbolise. Tonight, we examine Victorian Britain's obsession with fairy tales and the disturbing truth that the darkness they collected in folklore was darkness they were simultaneously living through in documented reality. We explore the brothers Grimm's arrival in England and the shock of educated Victorians discovering just how violent and disturbing these collected oral traditions truly were. We investigate British folklorists who began documenting their own country's fairy tales and found them even darker than the German imports. Tales of dismemberment, cannibalism, child murder, and supernatural vengeance that English peasants had been telling for centuries. And most disturbingly, we examine Victorian crimes that resembled fairy tale patterns with eerie precision. Serial poisoners who murdered spouse after spouse like Bluebeard, killing wife after wife. Baby farmers who disposed of hundreds of infants in patterns that echoed Hansel and Gretel's witch. Child prostitution systems that embodied every warning Red Riding Hood ever offered about wolves in human clothing. Whether these criminals were influenced by fairy tales, or whether both tales and crimes simply reflect enduring patterns of human darkness, we cannot definitively say. But the parallels are undeniable and deeply unsettling. Before we enter the Victorian world, where folklore and horror intertwined until the boundary between story and reality dissolved, tell me in the comments, what fairy tale frightened you as a child? Did you understand then that some of the darkness it described was real? And if you value investigations into how Victorian Britain confronted darkness in both their stories and their streets, subscribe to this channel for more explorations of history's forgotten horrors. I am Mr. Ravenhurst. This is Victorian Britain's fairy tale horrors. When the tales collected from peasant oral tradition proved darker than anyone expected. When Victorian crimes mirrored those tales with disturbing accuracy. When once upon a time became right now, documented in court records and medical examiner reports and newspaper accounts. When the only difference between fairy tale and reality was that reality offered fewer happy endings. Let us begin in 1823, when the brothers Grimm arrived in England and Victorian Britain discovered that the oral folklore of German peasants contained darkness respectable society was unprepared to confront. The year is 1823. A book appears in London bookshops. The title is German Popular Stories. The translator is Edgar Taylor. The contents are English translations of tales collected by two German brothers, Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm, from peasants and rural storytellers across the Germanic regions. Victorian Britain has been anticipating this book. Interest in folklore is growing. Educated people are aware that industrialization is destroying oral traditions. The old tales passed down through generations are vanishing as literacy spreads. and people move from villages to cities. The Grimm brothers have been collecting these vanishing tales in Germany. Now English readers can finally access them. What they find inside shocks them. These are not gentle children's stories. These are tales containing explicit violence, implied sexual danger, cannibalism, dismemberment, child murder, parental betrayal. These are tales where stepmothers cook and eat their stepchildren, where jealous queens order huntsmen to bring back lungs and liver as proof of murder, where children are abandoned in forests to starve, where witches fatten children in cages like livestock before slaughter, where people are punished by being forced into red-hot iron shoes and dancing until they die, where evil is punished through equally brutal violence, and where happy endings are often absent entirely. The brothers Grimm were scholars, not children's authors. They understood themselves as preserving cultural heritage before it disappeared forever. Between 1812 and 1857, they travelled through Germanic regions, recording tales from elderly people who remembered stories told to them in childhood. They documented these tales as accurately as possible, preserving the darkness peasant storytellers included. The Grimm brothers believed this darkness served important functions. It taught children that the world was dangerous. It prepared them for realities their lives would include: hunger, violence, betrayal, death. To sanitize the tales would be to lie about existence. But Victorian Britain is not prepared for this level of darkness in printed form. Reading about cannibalism in a book that sits on your shelf, that your children might open, that respectable people discuss in drawing rooms, this is different from hearing vague rumors that German peasants tell crude stories. The explicitness is shocking. The violence is overwhelming. And Victorian society begins a debate that will continue throughout the era. Are these tales appropriate for children? Do they corrupt tender minds or provide necessary warnings? Should they be banned, sanitized, or preserved in their authentic darkness? The Times of London publishes editorials questioning whether Grimm tales should be available in England. One 1843 editorial argues that German barbarities are unsuitable for English children. That accounts of cannibalism and mutilation, even in story form, damage developing minds. That children raised on such violent material will themselves become violent or mentally disturbed. That Britain should reject these foreign imports and maintain its own more civilized traditions. But other voices defend the tales. Andrew Lang, who will become one of Britain's most important folklorists, argues that fairy tales are not meant to teach children the world is perfect. They teach that evil exists, that danger is real, that survival requires courage and cleverness. Children who grow up believing the world is safe and everyone is kind are unprepared for reality. Fairy tales, Lang argues, are vaccination against naivety. They introduce darkness in controlled narrative form so children can process it safely. The debate reveals a fundamental tension in Victorian society. This is an era of extraordinary contrasts. Great wealth and desperate poverty exist side by side. Scientific advancement and stubborn superstition coexist. Public morality and private vice operate in parallel. Childhood is idealized as innocent, yet child labor is ubiquitous. Victorians want children to remain pure, yet they send children into factories and mines where that purity is destroyed. They are scandalized by fairy tale violence while tolerating real violence against children on massive scale. Perhaps this is why the Grimm debate becomes so intense. Victorian Britain is living through conditions that resemble fairy tale darkness. Children genuinely are abandoned by desperate parents. People genuinely do starve. Predators genuinely do target the vulnerable. The tales hit too close to uncomfortable realities. To accept them is to acknowledge the darkness Victorian society contains. To reject them is to maintain a comforting fiction of progress and civilization. Publishers respond with compromise. They create sanitized editions for children. The extreme violence is softened. Cannibalism becomes imprisonment. Dismemberment becomes vague threats. Sexual danger is removed entirely. Deaths are made less graphic. Punishments are reduced from brutal to merely stern. The Victorian sanitized Grimm becomes the standard version that will dominate into the 20th century and influence Disney adaptations in our own time. But scholars and serious folklore collectors know what has been removed. They understand that sanitization robs the tales of their original function. And some begin to wonder, if German peasants told tales this dark, what tales are English, Scottish, Welsh, and Irish peasants telling? Britain has its own oral folklore traditions, also vanishing under industrialization and literacy. Perhaps British tales are equally dark. Perhaps Britain's own cultural heritage contains violence and horror that educated society has simply never documented because no one thought to ask poor rural people what stories they tell. This question leads to something remarkable. In 1878, a group of scholars, antiquarians, and enthusiasts gather in London and found the Folklore Society. Their mission is urgent: document British oral traditions before they disappear forever. The older generation in rural areas still remembers tales from their childhood, before literacy became widespread, when storytelling was the primary entertainment and education for people who could not read. But this generation is dying. Within a few decades, the last people who remember the old tales will be gone. If the tales are not collected immediately, centuries of cultural heritage will vanish completely. The Folklore Society begins systematic collection. Members travel to rural Cornwall, Yorkshire, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, the rural reaches of England where oral tradition still survives. They seek out elderly informants. They record tales as accurately as possible, preserving dialect and detail. They publish these tales in the Society's journal, Folklore, which appears quarterly, beginning in 1878. And what they discover is extraordinary and disturbing. British fairy tales are not gentler than Grimm's German tales. They are often darker, more violent, more explicit in their brutality. British oral tradition has preserved tales that shock even the collectors who are specifically seeking darkness to document. Joseph Jacobs becomes one of the most important British fairy tale collectors. In 1890, he publishes English Fairy Tales, a compilation of tales gathered from English oral tradition. In his introduction, Jacobs writes something striking. He notes that the English folk tale is, as a rule, more bloodthirsty and grim than tales from other nations. The heroes are often brutal. The villains are dispatched with relish. Happy endings are sometimes absent entirely. This reflects, Jacobs suggests, the harsh realities of English peasant life across centuries. These were not people living comfortable existences. They experienced famine, disease, violence, early death. Their tales reflected their world. Let me give you a specific example of what Jacobs collected. A tale called Mr. Fox. This story was already known in Shakespeare's time. He references it in Much Ado About Nothing in 1598. But Jacobs documented the full version still being told in rural English villages in the 1880s, nearly 300 years after Shakespeare heard it. The tale goes like this. Lady Mary is being courted by a wealthy gentleman named Mr. Fox. He invites her to visit his castle. She goes but finds him absent. Exploring the castle alone, she discovers a door with writing carved into it. Be bold, but not too bold. She opens it. Another door inside. Be bold, but not too bold, lest that your heart's blood should run cold. She opens that door as well, and inside the room she finds corpses, the bodies of women, Mr. Fox's previous victims. He is a serial killer. He has been courting and murdering women for years, hiding their bodies in this secret room of his castle. Lady Mary is frozen in horror, staring at the corpses of women who, like her, were charmed by Mr. Fox's wealth and respectability. And then she hears sounds. Mr. Fox is returning to the castle. She hides as he enters, dragging another woman. Lady Mary watches through a gap as Mr. Fox begins to dismember this new victim. He hacks at the body with a sword. A severed hand, still wearing a ring, flies through the air and lands in Lady Mary's lap. She takes it and escapes while Mr. Fox is distracted by his butchery. Later, Mr. Fox visits Lady Mary's family for dinner, acting as though nothing has happened. During the meal, Lady Mary tells a story. She says she had the strangest dream. She dreamed she visited Mr. Fox's castle. Each time she describes another detail of what she saw, Mr. Fox interrupts to say, "It is not so, nor it was not so." But Lady Mary continues describing everything. The doors, the warnings, the room of corpses, the murdered woman, the dismemberment. And finally she says, "I dreamed of a severed hand flying through the air." And Mr. Fox says again, "It is not so, nor it was not so." And Lady Mary produces the hand from under the table and says, "But it is so, and it was so. Here's hand and ring I have to show." Her brothers immediately seize Mr. Fox and kill him. This tale was being told in English villages in the 1880s, not 300 years ago when Shakespeare heard it, not in some distant medieval past. Victorian farm workers and their families were telling this story to each other and to their children. A story about a serial killer who murders women, dismembers their bodies, and hides corpses in his castle. A story where the hero is a woman who survives through curiosity and cleverness, disobeying the warning, "Be not too bold," because being bold is precisely what saves her life by revealing the danger. Joseph Jacobs publishes this tale in English Fairy Tales in 1890. He notes in his commentary that this tale suggests warnings about murderous suitors have circulated in English oral tradition for centuries, perhaps millennia. The tale is a warning. Wealthy, charming men can be predators. Women who are curious enough to investigate suspicious circumstances may save their own lives. Trust must be earned, not given based on social status. Disobedience to dangerous men is not merely acceptable, but necessary for survival. And here is what makes this deeply unsettling. While English villages are telling the Mr. Fox tale in the 1880s, Victorian England is actively experiencing real serial killers whose patterns resemble Mr. Fox exactly. Women who marry or trust charming men and then die mysteriously. Bodies that are hidden. Killers who operate for years before exposure. The tale is not distant folklore about problems that no longer exist. It is a warning about dangers that are currently demonstrably real. But I am getting ahead of the narrative. Let me continue with what British folklore collectors discovered. Because Mr. Fox is not the only dark English tale Joseph Jacobs documented. Another tale he collected is called The Rose Tree. This one contains cannibalism. The story: a young girl lives with her cruel stepmother and stepsister. The stepmother hates the girl. One day, the stepmother murders the girl, dismembers her body, and cooks the pieces into meat pies. She feeds these pies to the girl's brother without telling him what he is eating. The brother unknowingly eats his sister, but he notices the bones are unusually fine and delicate. He saves them instead of throwing them away. He buries the bones under a rose tree in the garden. The rose tree grows supernaturally large and beautiful. A bird appears in the tree. The bird is the murdered girl's reincarnated spirit. The bird sings a song that reveals the entire story: the murder, the dismemberment, the cannibalism, the stepmother's guilt. People hear the song and understand what happened. Eventually, the bird drops a millstone on the stepmother's head, crushing her skull and killing her. The girl returns to life, restored from the rose tree. This tale contains explicit cannibalism. A child murdered and cooked. Forced cannibalism imposed on her brother. Graphic violence in the punishment. And this was being told to English children in rural areas during the Victorian era. Jacobs publishes it. Scholarly collections preserve it. But commercial publishers creating fairy tale books for middle-class Victorian children do not include it. The tale is too disturbing. It reveals something about English peasant culture that respectable society prefers not to acknowledge. That poverty and desperation and cruelty were so extreme in England's past that tales about cooking and eating children seem plausible enough to serve as warnings. Another English tale Jacobs collects is Molly Whuppie. This is less gruesome, but equally violent. 3 sisters are abandoned by their poor parents in a forest. They wander until they find a house owned by a giant. The giant's wife hides them, but the giant discovers them and plans to kill them in the night. Molly Whuppie, the youngest and cleverest sister, switches the sleeping positions. She puts the giant's own 3 daughters where she and her sisters are sleeping. In the darkness, the giant kills his own daughters by mistake. Molly and her sisters escape. But the tale continues. Molly returns to the giant's house multiple times on quests, repeatedly outwitting him, stealing his treasures, and eventually causing his death. The tale celebrates a clever child defeating a powerful adult through trickery and deception. It teaches that survival sometimes requires violence and that innocence may die as collateral damage in the process. The giant's daughters did nothing wrong. They were killed because Molly was clever enough to sacrifice them to save herself and her sisters. The tale presents this without moral judgment. Survival is what matters. Cleverness is rewarded. The deaths of innocents are unfortunate but necessary. Scottish fairy tales prove even darker in some respects. Scotland maintained strong belief in fairies, not gentle Disney-style fairies, but dangerous supernatural beings who stole children, kidnapped young women, and cursed families for generations. The most famous Scottish fairy tale is Tam Lin, which Joseph Jacobs also documents in his collection of British tales. Tam Lin is a human man held captive by the fairy queen. He was stolen as a child and has lived in the fairy realm for years. He explains to Janet, a young woman who encounters him, that every 7 years the fairies must pay a tithe to hell, a human sacrifice. This year, Tam Lin will be the sacrifice unless Janet rescues him. The rescue requires Janet to grab Tam Lin as the fairy procession passes on Halloween night and hold him while the fairies transform him into terrifying shapes. He becomes a snake, a bear, a lion, a red-hot iron bar, a burning coal. Janet must hold him through all transformations without letting go. If she succeeds, the fairy queen's power breaks and Tam Lin returns to human form permanently. Janet succeeds. The tale ends with Tam Lin freed, but the fairy queen furious, promising revenge on Janet's family for generations. The tale reflects Scottish belief in fairy danger, real enough that precautions were taken to protect children from abduction. Iron over doorways, rowan branches, specific prayers. These were not superstitious games, but genuine protective measures against perceived supernatural threats. Victorian folklorists documenting Scottish fairy tales in the 1870s and 80s discovered these beliefs were still held in rural Scotland. Elderly informants spoke of fairies not as fictional creatures, but as real dangers. They described people who had been taken by fairies and never returned. Children who disappeared and were assumed to be in fairy captivity. The boundary between folklore and genuine belief was non-existent for many rural Scots. The tales were not entertainment. They were warnings about real supernatural dangers their community faced. Welsh folklore, documented through translations of the Mabinogion and through direct collection from Welsh speakers, contained equally dark material. Tales of transformations, betrayals, magically created women who murdered their husbands, and prophecies that destroyed everyone they touched. Irish folklore documented by collectors in Ireland described banshees whose wails predicted family deaths, changelings who replaced human babies, and curses that could annihilate entire lineages. Cornwall, at England's southwestern tip, preserved tales about giants, underground mine spirits called knockers who could kill miners who disrespected them, and mermaids who deliberately drowned fishermen. The Cornish tale of Jack the Giant Killer involves explicit descriptions of Jack defeating giants by tricking them into cutting open their own stomachs, digging pits they fall into, and impaling themselves on spikes, and using magical items to outwit and kill creatures much stronger than himself. By the 1890s, the Folklore Society and individual collectors had documented hundreds of British fairy tales from oral tradition. The pattern was clear. British tales contained violence, darkness, betrayal, and harsh lessons about survival. They reflected a world where life was precarious, death was common, and children needed to learn that danger was real and trust was dangerous. These were not escapist fantasies. They were cultural education preparing children for the realities they would face. And this creates a profound irony. While Victorian Britain was collecting these dark tales and debating whether they were too disturbing for children, Victorian Britain was simultaneously creating conditions for children that were as dark as any fairy tale described. The tales warned about abandonment. Victorian Britain abandoned children in workhouses. The tales warned about predators. Victorian Britain permitted child prostitution on massive scale. The tales warned about cannibalistic consumption. Victorian Britain consumed children's bodies through labour that destroyed their health and killed them. The darkness Victorian folklore collectors documented was not safely contained in the past. It was present. It was real. It was documented in court records and medical examiner reports and parliamentary inquiries. And in some cases, the parallels between fairy tale patterns and Victorian crimes were so precise that the boundary between folklore and horror dissolved completely. Let me take you now from collected folklore into documented Victorian reality, into crimes that resembled fairy tales with disturbing accuracy, into real people whose actions echoed story patterns so closely that you might think they were consciously following scripts written centuries earlier. Whether they were actually influenced by tales, or whether both tales and crimes simply reflect enduring patterns of human darkness, I cannot definitively say. But I can show you the parallels, and I can let you decide what they mean. We begin with Bluebeard, the fairy tale collected by Charles Perrault in 1697 and known throughout Victorian Britain. The tale of a wealthy man with a blue beard who marries repeatedly. His wives disappear. He forbids his new wife from entering one room of his castle. She disobeys, opens the forbidden door, and discovers the corpses of all his previous wives murdered and hanging on hooks. He attempts to kill her for disobedience, but her brothers arrive and kill him first. The tale is a warning about serial killers hiding behind wealth and respectability, about curiosity saving lives, about how disobedience to dangerous men is survival, not sin. And while Victorian Britain is reading Bluebeard to children and debating whether it is too dark for tender minds, Victorian Britain is producing real Bluebeards. Let me introduce you to Mary Ann Cotton. Mary Ann Cotton was born 1832 in County Durham, England. She worked as a nurse. She married multiple times. And everywhere Mary Ann went, people around her died. Her 4 husbands died. Her mother died. At least 8 of her children died. 3 stepchildren died. Other children in her care died. Neighbours who annoyed her died. Her lover died. Death followed Mary Ann like a shadow, and every death benefited her financially, through inheritance or insurance, or simply by removing an inconvenient person. The method was consistent. Arsenic, administered gradually in food or drink. The symptoms mimicked gastric fever, a common Victorian ailment. Victims suffered abdominal pain, vomiting, weakness, eventual death over several days. Doctors diagnosed natural causes. Mary Ann collected insurance money or inheritance. Then she moved on to her next target. Sometimes she remarried. Sometimes she took a lover. Sometimes she simply needed to remove someone who stood between her and what she wanted. The pattern continued for over 20 years. From her first marriage in 1852 until her arrest in 1872, Mary Ann systematically murdered at least 21 people. Conservative estimates suggest 21. Some historians argue the total could be higher, perhaps 30 or more victims across 2 decades of poisoning. She was finally caught in 1872 when her last victim, 7-year-old Charles Edward Cotton, died under circumstances that aroused suspicion. Charles was her stepson, the child of her 4th husband. Both the husband and his older son had already died. Charles was the last obstacle to Mary Ann's freedom. She had taken a new lover and wanted to move on. Charles died in July 1872. A local official named Thomas Riley had been watching Mary Ann for months, suspicious of the pattern of deaths surrounding her. When Charles died, Riley demanded an inquest. The autopsy found arsenic. Charles Edward Cotton had been poisoned. Police exhumed other recent victims, arsenic in all of them. Mary Ann was arrested, tried and convicted in March 1873. She was hanged at Durham County Jail on March 24, 1873. Before her death, investigators calculated that she had likely killed at least 21 people over 20 years. Multiple husbands, multiple children, her own mother, stepchildren, children in her care who were not related to her. The body count rivals some modern serial killers. And the pattern, multiple spouses dying mysteriously, each death followed by remarriage, the truth hidden until someone investigates. This is Bluebeard's pattern, exactly. The gender is reversed. Mary Ann was female, Bluebeard is male. But the structure is identical. Serial murder of intimate partners, corpses hidden through attribution to natural causes, rather than behind a locked door. Charming, respectable exterior that allows continued operation. Discovery only when suspicion overcomes the facade of normalcy. Whether Mary Ann Cotton knew the Bluebeard tale, we cannot know. She was literate. She could read and write. She might have encountered the story. But more likely, she and Bluebeard simply represent the same pattern. Serial murder of intimate partners for profit has existed throughout human history. The fairy tale codified the pattern into narrative. Mary Ann enacted it. Both emerged from the same dark human capacity for viewing other people as obstacles to be removed rather than lives with value. But Mary Ann Cotton is not Victorian Britain's only Bluebeard. Let me tell you about Amelia Dyer. Amelia Dyer was born in 1837 in Bristol. She trained as a nurse. She married, had a daughter, became a widow. She needed income. She discovered a lucrative business, baby farming. This requires explanation because the practice is not widely known today, though it was common in Victorian Britain. Victorian society punished illegitimacy severely. An unmarried woman who became pregnant faced social destruction, employment loss, family rejection, inability to marry. The child would be stigmatized as illegitimate, facing discrimination throughout life. Desperate women sought ways to hide pregnancies and dispose of inconvenient babies. Baby farming provided the solution. Baby farmers advertised in newspapers. They offered to adopt babies or provide fostering for a fee. Mothers paid a lump sum, typically £10 to £20, and handed over their infants. The baby farmer promised to provide a good home. Some baby farmers were honest. They genuinely cared for children, but many were not. They took the money, killed the babies, and pocketed the profit. Amelia Dyer operated in the worst category. Her method was efficient. She placed newspaper advertisements offering adoption services. Desperate mothers responded. They paid the fee, handed over their babies, and left relieved that their problem was solved. Amelia promised loving care and country homes. She provided neither. Within days, sometimes within hours of receiving infants, Amelia murdered them. Her preferred method was strangulation with white dressmaking tape, narrow ribbon. She wrapped it around babies' necks and strangled them. Then she weighted the bodies with bricks, wrapped them in carpet bags or newspaper, and dumped them in the Thames River. This continued for approximately 30 years, from the 1860s until her arrest in 1896. The scale is difficult to calculate because records were poor and most bodies were never recovered. But estimates based on how frequently she placed advertisements, how many mothers are known to have used her services, and testimonies from people who witnessed parts of her operation suggest she murdered somewhere between 200 and 400 infants over those 30 years. Possibly more. The Thames swallowed most of the evidence. Amelia was caught in March 1896, when a bargeman pulled a carpet bag from the Thames at Reading. Inside was the body of a baby girl, strangled with white tape, wrapped in brown paper. The paper had a partially legible name and address. Police traced it to a woman calling herself Mrs. Thomas, one of Amelia's many aliases. They searched her home and found evidence: baby clothes, dressmaking tape, letters from desperate mothers. When police began questioning these mothers, they discovered none of the babies Amelia had adopted had been seen after handover. They were all dead. The Thames gave up 6 bodies in total during the investigation. All baby girls, all strangled with white dressmaking tape, all wrapped in similar fashion. But investigators knew there were dozens more, possibly hundreds more, weighted down in Thames mud, never to be recovered. Amelia had operated in multiple locations, under multiple names across decades. The full count would never be known. Her trial was brief. She was charged with murdering Doris Marmon, a 4-month-old girl. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury took 4.5 minutes to convict. The judge noted that while she was convicted of one murder, it was believed many other children had died at her hands. Amelia Dyer was hanged at Newgate Prison on June 10, 1896. Before her execution, she reportedly said, "I have done it. I have strangled them. So many I lost count." Amelia Dyer is not Bluebeard in the specific details. She murdered infants, not spouses. But she is Bluebeard in the pattern: multiple victims, hidden corpses, charming, respectable exterior. Her advertisements promised nice country homes and loving care. Forbidden knowledge. Mothers were never permitted to visit. Questions were discouraged. The truth was concealed until investigation penetrated the facade. Serial murder continuing for decades until exposure. The Bluebeard structure, with different specifics but identical function, and Mary Ann Cotton and Amelia Dyer were not unique. Victorian Britain produced multiple serial poisoners whose patterns echoed Bluebeard. Catherine Wilson poisoned multiple patients under her care as a nurse, killing at least 7 people before her execution in 1862. Christiana Edmonds, the chocolate cream killer, poisoned chocolates to murder a romantic rival and then created random poisonings to disguise the specific motive, killing at least 1 child and injuring many others before her conviction in 1872. The pattern appears repeatedly in Victorian criminal records. Poison, multiple victims, respectable exterior, financial or personal motives, discovery only when someone grows suspicious. These were real British Bluebeards. The tale was not fiction about distant times. It was pattern recognition of crimes that continue to occur. Now let me take you from serial murder into something even more disturbing because of its scale. Let me show you how Victorian Britain enacted Hansel and Gretel in reality, not through individual criminals but through systems. through institutions, through accepted social practices that abandoned children by the thousands and consumed them as surely as any fairy tale witch. Hansel and Gretel is a tale about abandonment and consumption. Parents too poor to feed their children abandon them in a forest. The children, lost and desperate, encounter a witch who imprisons them, fattens them, and prepares to eat them. They escape through cleverness and violence, burning the witch alive. The tale warns about economic desperation driving parents to terrible choices, about predators who consume children, about the need for children to be clever and ruthless to survive. Victorian Britain did not have witches with gingerbread houses, but it had economic conditions that led to child abandonment on massive scale. And it had institutions where abandoned children were imprisoned and their lives consumed. Let me show you what happened to children in Victorian workhouses. The Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834 restructured British poverty relief around workhouses. These were institutions where the poor could receive food and shelter in exchange for labour. The system was deliberately punitive. It operated on the principle of less eligibility. Workhouse conditions must be worse than the worst independent labourers' conditions. This would discourage dependence and motivate people to work rather than seek relief. For families with children, this created impossible situations. Entering a workhouse meant immediate family separation. Men sent to male wards, women to female wards. Children over age 2 removed to children's wards. Parents could not visit or comfort their children. Families saw each other rarely, if at all. This separation was intentional policy, designed to make workhouses so unpleasant that only the truly desperate would use them. Children in workhouses lived in overcrowded wards with minimal food and no heating. They wore workhouse uniforms. They performed labour, typically picking oakum, which meant pulling apart old rope to extract fibres. This was tedious, painful work. The rough fibres tore children's fingers. The dust damaged lungs. But children as young as 5 or 6 spent hours daily picking oakum because workhouses needed to be self-supporting and child labour was cheap. Disease was rampant. Overcrowding, plus malnutrition, plus poor sanitation, created perfect conditions for typhus, cholera, and tuberculosis. Child mortality in Victorian workhouses was staggeringly high. Records from 1840s London workhouses show infant mortality rates of 50 to 80% in the first year. Half to 4/5 of babies born in workhouses or brought there as infants died before their first birthday. Children who survived infancy still faced high mortality through childhood from disease, malnutrition, and neglect. Some parents chose workhouses as alternative to complete abandonment on streets. But entering a workhouse meant losing your children to institutional control. Some parents left workhouses but could not retrieve children. The children became effectively orphaned within the system, abandoned not on forest paths, but in institutional buildings where they died slowly of disease and hunger rather than quickly of exposure. By 1850, approximately 200,000 children lived in British workhouses. Not all were orphans. Many had living parents who simply could not afford to keep them. The workhouse functioned as institutional abandonment mechanism. Parents too poor to feed children could hand them to the state. The state provided bare subsistence while extracting labour. Children grew up without families, without affection, without education beyond basic literacy. They were raised by institutions that viewed them as economic units to be made self-supporting through labour. And sometimes the darkness of workhouse conditions was exposed through scandal. Let me tell you about Andover Workhouse in 1845. Andover was a workhouse in Hampshire that became notorious when investigators discovered paupers were so hungry they were eating rotten meat off the bones they were supposed to be crushing. The work assignment at Andover was bone crushing. Animal carcass bones were brought to the workhouse. Paupers, including children, were required to smash these bones into powder to be sold as fertilizer. But the workhouse master had been deliberately reducing food rations below even the minimal workhouse standards to save money. The paupers, including children, were starving. They were so desperately hungry that they fought over bones that still had bits of putrid meat clinging to them. They ate this rotten meat raw while crushing the bones. When investigators discovered this, they were shocked. Even by Victorian standards of harsh treatment of the poor, Andover was extreme. The investigation revealed systematic cruelty. The master beat paupers who worked too slowly. He sexually assaulted female inmates. Children received even less food than adults. The entire operation was designed to maximize profit through minimizing expenditure on human beings who had no power to resist. The master was dismissed. But the scandal revealed that Andover was not unique. Many workhouses operated similarly, they simply had not yet been exposed. Another scandal erupted in 1848 at Drouet's Asylum in Tooting, South London. This was a private facility contracted by various parishes to house their workhouse children. Parishes paid Drouet per child. Drouet maximized profit by cramming 1,400 children into a building designed for 600, feeding them minimal amounts of bread and gruel, providing no heating during the severe winter of 1848, and maintaining filthy conditions with no proper sanitation. When cholera broke out in winter 1848 to 49, 180 children died. The mortality rate was extraordinary, even by Victorian standards. Investigation revealed Drouet had essentially been torturing children through deprivation to maximize profit. He was charged with manslaughter. The jury acquitted him. They decided cholera caused the deaths, not neglect. Medical understanding was limited, but everyone knew the conditions were horrific. The scandal prompted some workhouse reforms, though they came too late for the dead children. Beyond institutional workhouses, baby farming provided another abandonment mechanism. I have already described Amelia Dyer's operation, but baby farming as a system was broader. It was estimated that 70 to 90% of babies given to baby farmers died within the first year. Some baby farmers murdered immediately. Others provided minimal care, allowing natural death through starvation, exposure, or disease. Thousands of babies disappeared into this system annually. Most deaths were never investigated. They were attributed to natural weakness. Victorian infant mortality was high enough that baby deaths seemed unremarkable. And then there was child labour. The Hansel and Gretel witch fattens children to eat them, to consume their bodies for her benefit. Victorian Britain consumed children's bodies through labour that destroyed health, stunted growth, caused injuries, and often killed them. The consumption was economic rather than literal. But from the children's perspective, the destruction of their bodies for adult profit was equally absolute. In early Victorian factories, 30 to 50% of workers were under age 18, many under age 10. Children worked 12 to 16-hour days, 6 days per week. They operated dangerous machinery. They crawled under moving equipment to retrieve dropped materials or clear jams. Injuries were common: crushed fingers, severed limbs, scalping when hair caught in machinery, falls from heights. Children developed lung diseases from textile dust. Their growth was stunted by malnutrition combined with long hours of standing. Exhaustion caused accidents that killed them. Factory Acts beginning in 1833 attempted regulation. Minimum ages were gradually raised, hours were gradually reduced, but progress was slow. Enforcement was limited. Many factories violated regulations, and Factory Acts initially applied only to textile mills. Other industries remained unregulated longer. Coal mines employed children in particularly horrific conditions. Trappers were young children, ages 4 to 8, who sat alone in darkness, operating ventilation doors. When mine carts approached, they opened doors, then closed them. They spent 12 to 16 hours daily in complete darkness, alone, cold, for pennies. Hurriers were older children who pulled coal carts through tunnels on hands and knees, wearing harnesses like animals. Tunnels were often 2 to 3 feet high. Adults could not fit. Children dragged tons of coal daily through these cramped spaces. Explosions, cave-ins, and floods killed hundreds of children annually in British coal mines. The Mines Act of 1842 prohibited boys under age 10 from underground work. This was prompted by parliamentary inquiries that revealed conditions so horrific they exceeded even Victorian tolerance. Investigators documented children working from age 5, working naked or nearly naked due to heat and humidity in deep mines, developing severe deformities from crawling with heavy loads, experiencing sexual abuse underground, and dying at rates comparable to soldiers in wartime. Chimney sweeps employed climbing boys, children aged 4 to 10 who climbed inside chimneys to clean them. The chimneys in Georgian and early Victorian buildings were narrow and twisted. Adults could not fit. Children climbed naked because clothes would catch soot and impede movement. They scraped soot while breathing it constantly. They suffered burns from climbing recently used chimneys. They got stuck in flues and sometimes died trapped and suffocating. They developed chimney sweeps cancer, scrotal cancer caused by soot exposure, the first occupational cancer ever identified. Master sweeps trained boys by lighting fires below them while they were in chimneys, forcing them to climb to escape burning. The Chimney Sweeps Act of 1875 finally prohibited using children for climbing chimneys. This was shockingly late. The practice had been controversial since the late 18th century, but economic incentives and master sweeps lobbying delayed prohibition for nearly a century. Thousands of boys died over the 19th century as climbing sweeps. Exact numbers are unknown because many deaths were never recorded. Boys who got stuck and died inside chimneys were sometimes left there, chimneys simply bricked up with bodies inside. Victorian child abandonment and exploitation parallels Hansel and Gretel's structure with disturbing precision. Economic desperation drove parents to abandon children, literally on streets or at foundling hospitals, or institutionally through workhouses and baby farms. Workhouses, factories, mines, and master sweeps held children in conditions they could not escape. Children had no legal rights, no ability to refuse, no recourse against abuse. Their bodies were consumed through labor. Their health was destroyed. Their growth was stunted. They were used up for economic benefit of employers and society. Hansel and Gretel escaped through cleverness and violence. Most Victorian abandoned children did not escape. They died in workhouses or were killed by baby farmers or survived childhood labor, only to die young from accumulated damage. The scale dwarfs the fairy tale. 2 children in the story. Hundreds of thousands of Victorian children abandoned and consumed annually. The fairy tale Hansel and Gretel was read throughout Victorian Britain. Every middle-class child encountered it. Working-class children heard it. Yet Victorian society simultaneously abandoned children on massive scale. Did the tale desensitize society to child abandonment by normalizing the concept? Did it make abandonment thinkable, even acceptable? Or did reality make the tale resonate because people recognized the pattern in their own society? Some Victorians fought against this darkness. Lord Shaftesbury spent his life championing child welfare reform. He promoted Factory Acts, the Mines Act, the Chimney Sweeps Act. He investigated workhouse conditions. He founded ragged schools providing free education for slum children. Charles Dickens used fiction to expose child exploitation. Oliver Twist depicted workhouse horrors. Nicholas Nickleby exposed boarding school abuse. David Copperfield showed child labour exploitation. His novels mobilised middle-class sentiment against child suffering. Dr. Barnardo founded Barnardo's Homes in 1870, providing shelter for destitute children. By his death in 1905, Barnardo's Homes had sheltered 60,000 children. saving them from streets, workhouses, or worse. These reformers fought the Hansel and Gretel pattern. They tried to prevent abandonment, provide alternatives to exploitation, and protect vulnerable children. Progress was slow, but by late Victorian era, child welfare had improved significantly from early Victorian horrors. Now let me take you into the darkest parallel of all, into Victorian patterns that echoed Red Riding Hood, into predators who targeted vulnerable children, into systems that enabled abuse on massive scale, into a scandal that finally forced Victorian Britain to confront the wolves in human clothing that walked among them. Red Riding Hood, in its earliest forms, dealt openly with themes of danger, vulnerability, and deception. The wolf symbolized a manipulative figure who used charm, disguise, and seemingly respectable behavior to gain access to someone young and unprotected. Red Riding Hood's solitary journey represented exposure to risks that arise when navigating hostile spaces without support. The tale worked as a warning. Harmful intent is often hidden behind polite appearances, and danger frequently approaches in the guise of safety. Victorian Britain softened these tales, removing their sharper warnings. Yet the society that purified stories was simultaneously living through large-scale exploitation of vulnerable young people. The Red Riding Hood pattern, a predatory figure using deception to target those with little protection, was not a distant fable, but a daily, documented reality. Reformers of the era estimated that thousands of impoverished girls, many between 12 and 16, were caught in cycles of urban exploitation. Some estimates were higher. This was not hidden from view. Certain districts of London made these dangers publicly visible, where poverty, lack of oversight, and systemic neglect created conditions in which young people were easily targeted. Part of the problem was legal. Until 1885, the age of consent was set at 12, leaving many minors without meaningful protection. Families facing severe hardship sometimes allowed daughters to enter precarious occupations simply to survive. Some young people tried to support themselves independently to avoid starvation or institutional confinement. Police often intervened only when public order was disrupted, not to safeguard the vulnerable. Networks existed for recruiting and directing minors into harmful situations. Women known as procuresses acted as intermediaries, and introduction houses facilitated discreet transactions. Even coded newspaper advertisements played a role, revealing a system that operated with surprising openness. Victorian respectability, therefore, bore a deep contradiction. Public morality condemned vice. Private demand sustained it. Many who spoke of purity in public quietly contributed to the very system they denounced. This contradiction endured for decades. Reformers documented it, clergy preached against it, activists protested it, but polite society preferred silence. As long as these issues were not spoken of directly, they could be ignored. Everything changed in 1885 when journalist William Thomas Stead shattered this silence. Collaborating with campaigner Josephine Butler and former intermediary Rebecca Jarrett, Stead undertook an undercover investigation meant to demonstrate how easily a minor could be drawn into exploitation. They arranged a stage purchase of a 13-year-old girl, Eliza Armstrong, with the intention of placing her immediately under protective care, which they did through the Salvation Army. The purpose was not the act itself, but the demonstration that a system allowing such transactions existed in plain sight. Stead published his findings in July 1885 in a series called The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon. The articles described how intermediaries operated, what payments were expected, and where such arrangements were made. They detailed the structures, the introduction houses, and the social profiles of the men who fueled demand. Outwardly respectable professionals who upheld public virtue while privately sustaining exploitation. Stead even traced international channels through which vulnerable English girls could be transported abroad. Victorian society erupted, not because the system was previously unknown, but because Stead forced the public to confront it directly. The old Victorian compromise, "we know, but we do not speak," collapsed. Crowds protested. Churches mobilized. Women's reform groups launched coordinated campaigns. Political pressure surged. Within months, Parliament passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885. The age of consent was raised from 12 to 16. Penalties for exploiting minors were strengthened. Police gained clearer authority to shut down introduction houses. Recruiting young people for harmful purposes became explicitly illegal. This was real progress, though imperfectly enforced. The underlying structures continued in diminished form, and cultural attitudes shifted slowly. Ironically, Stead himself was prosecuted for his investigative methods. Although his intentions were protective, he had technically violated the law in arranging Eliza's removal. He was convicted and served 3 months in prison, a striking example of Victorian ambivalence, punishing the reformer while long-standing perpetrators went unpunished. Here, the Red Riding Hood parallel becomes unmistakable. Victorian exploitation of minors mirrored the tale's pattern exactly. Those seeking to harm the vulnerable often presented themselves as trustworthy, respectable, and safe. Deception was fundamental. Young people, isolated in crowded and indifferent urban environments, had little defense. And for decades, society ignored warnings, because acknowledging them meant confronting its own failures. Victorian Britain told children a sanitized Red Riding Hood, stripped of its deeper cautionary meaning, while failing to protect actual girls from real-world equivalents of the wolf. By turning the wolf into a harmless animal and the danger into a generic adventure, the Victorians removed the tale's specific message about human predators and concealed threats behind courteous masks. This sanitization contributed to a culture of silence. Victorian prudery, which refused to speak openly about real dangers, left children and teenagers without honest warnings. The fairy tale's protective function vanished. At precisely the moment such warnings were most needed, they were made inaccessible. Meanwhile, Victorian Britain was also founding the Folklore Society in 1878, hoping to preserve oral traditions before they disappeared. What the collectors found was that British folklore was as dark as, and often darker than, the Grimm tales, Mr. Fox, the serial killer, the Rose Tree with its brutal themes, Molly Whoopie surviving violence, Scottish stories of abduction by supernatural beings, Welsh tales of curses and transformations, Irish omens of death. These narratives reflected centuries of hardship, danger, and fear. And these themes were not remote. Victorian Britain lived through events that paralleled them. Mary Ann Cotton, poisoning multiple family members like a real-world Bluebeard. Amelia Dyer killing infants entrusted to her care, echoing the archetype of the child-devouring witch. Workhouses that abandoned children in ways reminiscent of Hansel and Gretel's forest. Urban exploitation that matched every symbolic warning embedded in Red Riding Hood. Whether folklore shaped these crimes or both sprang from recurring patterns of human behavior is impossible to know. Most likely, the tales preserved cultural memory of dangers that repeat themselves because human nature remains consistent. Harm, neglect, and predatory behavior have always existed. Fairy tales distilled these realities into story form. Victorian society, in turn, revealed the continued truth of those patterns. What Victorian Britain teaches is that the darkness in fairy tales is not safely sealed in the past. The patterns they describe are real. They recur. They demand vigilance. These stories were not originally escapist entertainment. They were survival guides born of lived experience. Victorian collectors preserved the tales, but by softening them for children, the era created a dangerous divide. Scholars kept the authentic warnings, while young people were given harmless versions lacking their protective function. The lessons remained in archives, inaccessible to those who needed them most. Reformers such as Shaftesbury, Dickens, Barnardo, and Stead confronted the darkness the tales warned about. They fought child abandonment, exploitation, and systemic neglect. Their efforts achieved partial victories, proving that awareness can lead to change. That darkness can be resisted, even if not fully eliminated. This is the legacy we inherit, the tales preserved, the realities lived, and the reforms initiated. They leave us enduring questions. Do dark stories harm or protect children? Should traditional tales be preserved in full or reshaped for modern sensibilities? Do stories reflect reality or help shape it? What responsibility does society bear when narrative patterns mirror real dangers? Victorian Britain offers a case study. It collected the darkest remnants of British storytelling while living through horrors that echoed those very tales. And it began slowly to confront and address the dangers it had long ignored. The tales do not promise comfort or happy endings. They teach harsher truths, that harm exists, danger is real, trust can be misplaced, and survival sometimes demands caution, cleverness, and resilience. These are not pleasant lessons, but they are truthful. Victorian Britain demonstrated that the patterns in folklore persist across eras. Bluebeard's locked chamber has modern equivalents. The child-devouring witch appears in institutional neglect and criminal exploitation. The wolf in disguise still walks among us. The tales remember what we want to forget, that danger is rarely distant, rarely imaginary, rarely confined to once upon a time. The forests have changed, but the wolves have not. The collectors preserved these memories. Victorian reality confirmed their relevance, and we inherit both the tales and the responsibility to heed their warnings. Forgetting danger is the most dangerous story of all. The tales endure because reality continues to echo them. They are dark because the world contains darkness. They disturb because disturbance sometimes protects better than comfort. They prepare because gentleness alone cannot guard against genuine harms. Victorian Britain, collecting folklore while confronting horror, embodied this duality. They recorded warnings while failing to apply them. They preserved stories about danger while allowing danger to flourish. Whether this is coincidence or testimony to recurring human patterns, the lesson is the same. Fairy tales are not trivial entertainment. They are cultural memory of threats that persist. They remain necessary because the dangers they describe still exist. We inherit both the stories and the responsibility to remember their meaning. Vigilance matters. Silence is costly. Warnings must not be forgotten. The forests are different now, but the patterns remain. And the question Victorian Britain leaves us is simple. Will we listen to the warnings, or sanitize them until we must learn their lessons again through painful experience? The tales have endured. The dangers they describe have not vanished, and the responsibility to acknowledge them, that is our inheritance. So what have we learned from this journey through Victorian Britain's darkest fairy tales? What does it mean that a society collected folklore about abandonment, predation, and serial murder, while simultaneously living through documented realities that mirrored those patterns? Let us step back from the individual stories and consider what they reveal about human nature, about cultural memory, about the relationship between the darkness we imagine and the darkness we create. Victorian Britain in 1878 stood at a crossroads. The Industrial Revolution had transformed the nation. Railways connected once isolated villages. Telegraphs carried messages across continents in minutes. Gas lamps pushed back the darkness of city streets. Scientific understanding advanced rapidly. Medicine, chemistry, biology, all were revealing nature's secrets through observation and experiment. The modern world was emerging. Progress seemed inevitable. Yet at this moment of unprecedented advancement, the Folklore Society gathered in London and decided that preserving oral traditions about witches, curses, and supernatural danger was urgent work. Why? Because they understood something profound. They recognized that these tales, dismissed by many as primitive superstition, contained wisdom about human nature that scientific progress could not replace. The stories encoded patterns of behavior, predation, betrayal, survival that remained relevant regardless of technological advancement. The brothers Grimm had recognized this decades earlier. When Jacob and Wilhelm traveled through Germanic regions recording peasant tales, they were not collecting entertainment. They were documenting cultural memory. Each tale they preserved represented centuries of oral transmission. Generation after generation had told these stories because they served essential functions. They taught children about danger. They prepared communities for harsh realities. They provided frameworks for understanding misfortune. They warned about patterns of evil that recurred across eras. Victorian Britain, receiving these tales in English translation, initially reacted with shock. The violence was too explicit. The darkness was too extreme. Respectable society debated whether such material corrupted tender minds. Publishers created sanitized versions for children. The extreme violence was softened. Sexual danger was removed. Happy endings were guaranteed. The Victorian compromise emerged, preserved the tales in scholarly collections while offering children bowdlerized versions that removed precisely the warnings the tales were meant to convey. But here is what Victorian Britain failed to recognize in their debate about whether fairy tales were too dark for children. The tales were not describing hypothetical dangers or imaginary evils. They were encoding real patterns of human behavior that persisted across time. Bluebeard's serial murder of wives, Hansel and Gretel's abandonment by desperate parents, Red Riding Hood's predator wearing disguise. These patterns existed in medieval Europe when the tales emerged. They existed in Victorian Britain when the Folklore Society collected them. They exist today in different forms, but identical structures. Mary Ann Cotton did not need to read Bluebeard to become a serial poisoner. The pattern, charming exterior, concealing murderous intent, multiple victims, financial motive, emerges independently from human capacity for evil. But the Bluebeard tale preserves cultural memory that such people exist. It warns communities to watch for suspicious patterns. It validates intuition when something seems wrong. It teaches that wealth and respectability do not guarantee virtue. These lessons remain relevant whether the serial killer uses a sword or arsenic. Amelia Dyer did not need Hansel and Gretel to imagine killing children for profit. The economic conditions that made baby farming lucrative, illegitimacy stigma, poverty, desperate mothers, created opportunities for predators regardless of folklore. But the tale preserves cultural memory that adults sometimes consume children, literally or metaphorically. It warns that apparent kindness can conceal exploitation. It teaches children that survival sometimes requires recognizing danger and acting ruthlessly to escape. These lessons applied in medieval forests and Victorian London equally. Victorian child prostitution did not require Red Riding Hood to exist. Poverty, power imbalance, and predatory men created the conditions independently. But the tale, in its original uncensored form, explicitly warned girls about sexual danger from men who appear friendly. Victorian Britain's sanitization of this tale, removing the sexual subtext, making the wolf a literal animal, robbed it of its protective function at precisely the historical moment when Victorian girls needed those warnings most. The tale could have helped. Instead, it was neutered into harmlessness. This is the tragedy of Victorian Britain's relationship with fairy tales. They recognized the tales contained darkness. They debated endlessly whether that darkness was appropriate for children. They created sanitized versions that removed what made the tales functional as warnings. And simultaneously, they lived through social conditions that mirrored the tale's darkness with disturbing precision. The disconnect is almost incomprehensible. Victorian society possessed cultural tools, preserved in folklore, for recognizing and addressing patterns of evil. Instead of using those tools, they sanitized them until they became useless. But perhaps this is unfair. Perhaps expecting Victorian Britain to recognize the connection between their folklore and their reality asks too much. After all, we face similar disconnects today. We tell children fairy tales as entertainment while often failing to recognize contemporary patterns those tales could illuminate. We have our own Bluebeards, our own abandoned children, our own predators wearing respectable disguises. The patterns persist because human nature persists. Evil adapts to new contexts but retains familiar structures. What Victorian Britain did achieve, through the Folklore Society and collectors like Joseph Jacobs and Andrew Lang, was preservation. Without their work, British oral traditions would have vanished completely. The industrialization and urbanization destroying the conditions that preserved oral folklore would have erased centuries of cultural memory. Future generations would have lost access to tales reflecting their ancestors' accumulated wisdom about human darkness and survival strategies. The Victorian collectors saved that heritage. They saved it imperfectly. They filtered tales through their own perspectives and biases. They sometimes cleaned up language or softened elements they found too crude. They preserved what elderly rural informants remembered in the 1870s and 80s, but missed earlier variations already lost. They documented tales, but could not fully capture the oral performance, the teller's voice, timing, audience interaction that was integral to how tales functioned. The preservation was incomplete, but it was invaluable. The British tales they collected revealed that Britain's oral tradition contained darkness equal to or exceeding the Grimm tales that had shocked Victorian sensibilities. Mr. Fox with his room of murdered women's corpses. The Rose Tree with its cannibalism and reincarnation through violence. Molly Whuppie defeating giants through trickery that sacrificed innocence. Scottish tales of fairy abduction and transformation. Welsh tales of betrayal and magical punishment. Irish tales of banshees and death omens. British folklore preserved warnings about every form of human evil and supernatural danger their ancestors believed they faced. And those ancestors faced considerable dangers. Medieval and early modern Britain experienced famine, plague, violence, high mortality, harsh conditions that made survival precarious. The tales emerged from that reality. They reflected a world where parents might genuinely need to abandon children because feeding everyone was impossible, where powerful men could murder without consequence, where predators operated openly because protective systems were absent, where children needed to learn early that the world was dangerous and survival required vigilance, cleverness, and sometimes ruthlessness. Victorian Britain, despite its industrial advancement and imperial power, still contained echoes of those harsh realities. The poor still faced conditions of desperate poverty. Children still died at shocking rates from disease, malnutrition, and exploitation. Women still had minimal legal protection against violent husbands or predatory employers. The underclass lived lives that would not seem unfamiliar to medieval peasants who originated the fairy tales. Progress was real, but unevenly distributed. For many Victorians, the world remained as dark and dangerous as any fairy tale forest. This is why the parallels between Victorian crimes and fairy tale patterns are not coincidental. Both emerged from similar conditions. Both reflected similar human behaviors under stress. Both demonstrated that certain patterns, serial murder, child abandonment, predation, betrayal, recur whenever social conditions create opportunities and motives. Fairy tales preserved cultural memory of these patterns. Victorian reality demonstrated their continued presence. The tales were not prophecy, they were recognition that human darkness follows predictable paths. What can we learn from Victorian Britain's experience? Several lessons seem clear. First, that dismissing folklore as primitive superstition robs us of accumulated cultural wisdom. The tales contain insights about human nature and social patterns that remain relevant regardless of technological progress. Discarding them because they seem outdated or disturbing leaves us less prepared for dangers that persist in new forms. Second, that sanitizing difficult content for children may do more harm than good. Victorian Britain removed dark elements from fairy tales, believing this protected children. But those dark elements served protective functions, warning about real dangers, teaching survival strategies, preparing for harsh realities. Removing warnings does not eliminate dangers. It merely leaves children unprepared. Modern debates about whether children should encounter difficult topics echo Victorian concerns. But perhaps the question is not whether to expose children to darkness, but how to frame it so they learn without being traumatized. Third, that the gap between official morality and actual behavior creates blind spots where terrible things flourish. Victorian Britain publicly condemned immorality while privately tolerating child prostitution, endemic domestic violence, and exploitation of the vulnerable. The disconnect between stated values and actual practices allowed predators to operate. When society refuses to honestly confront problems because acknowledging them seems improper, those problems continue unchecked. Fairy tales, by directly addressing darkness, model the honesty needed to confront real evils. Fourth, that reform requires first acknowledging reality. Victorian progress on child welfare came only after scandals forced public recognition of conditions that had existed for decades. The Andover workhouse horror, Drouet's asylum deaths, Stead's maiden tribute expose. These moments of forced awareness prompted legal and social changes. But they came late, after countless victims had suffered. Perhaps if Victorian Britain had taken seriously the warnings encoded in fairy tales about child endangerment, they would have addressed these issues sooner. Cultural memory existed. They failed to apply it. Fifth, that patterns of evil are recognizable and therefore potentially preventable. Serial murder, child exploitation, predatory behavior, these follow patterns that fairy tales codified into narratives centuries ago. When we see those patterns emerging in our own time, we have tools for recognition. The tales teach what warning signs look like. They show how predators operate. They demonstrate that respectability and charm can conceal murderous intent. This knowledge, preserved through oral tradition, remains protective if we choose to use it. But here is the difficult truth. Recognizing patterns is not the same as preventing them. Victorian Britain had the fairy tales. They knew the stories about serial murderers and abandoned children and predators in disguise. Yet, Mary Ann Cotton still poisoned 21 people. Amelia Dyer still killed 400 infants. Workhouses still destroyed children through neglect. The knowledge existed. It was not applied. Having cultural tools for recognizing evil means nothing if society lacks the will to use them. Why did Victorian Britain fail to connect their folklore with their reality? Partially, it was class blindness. The educated people who collected and studied fairy tales were not the ones suffering in workhouses or losing children to baby farmers. The horror was distant, abstract, a problem affecting people they rarely encountered. Fairy tales were intellectual curiosities, not applicable warnings. The disconnect between their comfortable reality and the desperate reality of the Victorian poor allowed them to miss obvious parallels. Partially, it was the same Victorian prudery that sanitized the tales. Acknowledging that British society contained serial murderers, that respectable-seeming people committed atrocities, that children were systematically exploited. These admissions challenged Victorian self-image as civilized and advanced. Easier to study German peasant tales as foreign curiosities than to recognize those patterns in London streets. Easier to debate whether fairy tales corrupted children than to confront real evils destroying actual children. Partially, it was the pace of change. Victorian Britain was transforming so rapidly that continuities with the past were easy to miss. Railways, telegraphs, gaslighting, scientific advancement. Everything suggested they were leaving old problems behind. Fairy tales seemed like relics of a superstitious past. The possibility that they described patterns persisting into the modern era did not occur to people focused on progress and futurity. They looked forward, not recognizing that some things do not change despite technological advancement. And partially, it was simple human reluctance to acknowledge darkness. It is easier to believe evil is rare, exceptional, something that happens elsewhere to other people. Fairy tales, by making evil explicit and central, force recognition of darkness that most people prefer to deny. Victorian Britain, like every era, wanted to believe they had transcended the brutal conditions that produced those tales. Acknowledging that they had not, that evil persisted in their midst, required courage they often lacked. The Victorian reformers who did make connections, Lord Shaftesbury fighting for child labour laws, Charles Dickens exposing workhouse horrors through fiction, Dr. Barnardo founding homes for destitute children, William Stead investigating child prostitution. These were people willing to see darkness and act against it. They recognized that the evils fairy tales described were not safely contained in the past. They were present, ongoing, requiring urgent response, and they faced tremendous resistance. Society does not thank people who force recognition of uncomfortable truths, but their efforts mattered. The Factory Acts, Mines Act, Chimney Sweeps Act, Criminal Law Amendment Act, Raising Age of Consent, Prevention of Cruelty to Children Act. These reforms improved conditions for millions. Progress was slow, incomplete, resisted at every step. But it happened. Victorian Britain in 1900 offered better protection for children than Victorian Britain in 1840. The arc was long but bent toward justice. The horrors documented in this investigation prompted changes that prevented some future horrors. This is perhaps the most important lesson Victorian Britain teaches us. That cultural memory of darkness, preserved in fairy tales, can serve protective functions if we recognize their relevance. That acknowledging evil is the first step toward confronting it. That reform requires courage to see uncomfortable truths and persistence to change them. That progress is possible even when darkness seems overwhelming. That the question is not whether evil exists, fairy tales and history both confirm it does, but whether we will recognize its patterns and resist them. The fairy tales Victorian Britain collected are not comfortable. They describe abandonment, betrayal, murder, predation, cruelty, suffering. They offer no reassurance that good always triumphs or that evil always receives punishment. They reflect a world where survival is precarious and requires vigilance. They are, in other words, honest about realities that polite society prefers to ignore. This honesty is precisely what makes them valuable. Victorian Britain's documented crimes prove the tales were not exaggerating. The darkness they described was real, present, ongoing. Pattern recognition encoded in folklore could have helped identify and prevent some Victorian atrocities if society had been willing to apply that knowledge. Instead, The tales were studied as curiosities, while the patterns they warned against played out in Victorian streets. The disconnect represents a failure of imagination, of courage, of will. We inherit both the tales and the responsibility to learn from Victorian Britain's failures. The patterns persist. Serial murderers still charm their way into victims' trust before killing. Children are still exploited by adults who should protect them. Predators still wear respectable disguises. Economic desperation still drives people to terrible choices. The specific mechanisms change. Poison becomes prescription drugs. Baby farming becomes child trafficking. But the underlying patterns remain recognizable. The fairy tales give us frameworks for recognizing these patterns. Bluebeard teaches us that serial killers hide behind respectability. Hansel and Gretel teaches us that economic stress endangers children, and that survival sometimes requires children's own agency. Red Riding Hood teaches us that predators disguise themselves, and that young people need explicit warnings about danger. These lessons remain applicable. The question is whether we, like Victorian Britain, will fail to apply them, or whether we will use cultural memory to protect the vulnerable. This requires honesty about darkness that many find uncomfortable. It requires acknowledging that evil is not rare or exceptional, but follows patterns recognizable across centuries. It requires admitting that our society, like Victorian Britain, likely contains horrors we prefer not to see. It requires courage to look at fairy tale warnings and ask where similar patterns exist today. It requires will to act on what we see rather than dismissing concerns as overreaction or alarmism. The Victorian collectors who preserved British fairy tales gave us a gift. They documented cultural wisdom that would otherwise have vanished. They recorded warnings that remain relevant. They preserved patterns that still require recognition. What we do with that gift is our choice. We can treat the tales as entertainment, as historical curiosities, as safely distant fictions, or we can recognize them as what they are: accumulated cultural wisdom about human darkness and survival strategies, relevant whenever vulnerable people face threats from those with power over them. Victorian Britain collected dark folklore while living through dark reality and failed to connect them. They debated whether tales were too disturbing for children, while actual children suffered horrors equal to any story. They sanitized warnings while dangers persisted. They focused on progress while patterns remained. This represents a cautionary tale itself, a warning about the dangers of failing to apply cultural wisdom, of prioritizing comfort over truth, of believing advancement eliminates ancient patterns. We can learn from their failure. We can recognize that the darkness fairy tales describe is not safely contained in once upon a time. It walks among us still, wearing modern clothing, using contemporary technologies, but following patterns old as human society. The tales teach us to recognize those patterns. Victorian history teaches us the cost of failing to act on recognition. Together, folklore and history provide tools for protecting the vulnerable if we choose to use them. The roses still bloom in Victorian Britain's memory, white and red side by side, keeping promises humans could not keep, remembering what time obscured. Every year they flower, a memorial to innocence lost, to bonds broken, to the gap between fairy tale happy endings and reality's complications. They remind us that the tales were never just stories. They were always mirrors showing us ourselves, our darkness, our capacity for evil, our patterns repeated across generations. Victorian Britain looked in that mirror and saw German peasant superstition. They failed to recognize their own reflection. They collected tales about serial murderers while Mary Ann Cotton poisoned families. They preserved stories about child consumption while Amelia Dyer drowned infants. They documented warnings about predators while child prostitution flourished. The failure was not in the tales, which accurately described patterns of human evil. The failure was in Victorian Britain's unwillingness to see those patterns in their own society. We have the same choice. The tales still exist, still warn, still teach. Victorian history still demonstrates the cost of ignoring warnings. The patterns still persist in forms adapted to our era. Will we recognize them? Will we act? Or will we, like Victorian Britain, study darkness in folklore while failing to confront darkness in reality? The fairy tales are not lies. The darkness is not fiction. The warnings are not outdated. And Victorian Britain's experience teaches us that knowledge without action accomplishes nothing. The tales preserved wisdom. History proved that wisdom relevant. Now the question belongs to us. What will we do with what we know? Will we protect the vulnerable or look away? Will we recognize patterns or deny them? Will we act or rationalize inaction? Victorian Britain's fairy tale horrors were both collected folklore and lived experience, both story and reality, both warning and documentation, both past and pattern continuing into the present. We inherit their tales, their history, their failures and their lessons. What we do with that inheritance determines whether we learn from Victorian Britain's experience or repeat their mistakes in our own era with our own victims. The roses bloom. The tales remember. The patterns persist. The choice is ours. This is what Victorian Britain teaches us. This is what fairy tales preserve. This is what history demands we acknowledge. The darkness is real. The warnings are valid. The patterns continue. And only by recognizing truth, however uncomfortable, can we hope to protect those endangered by evils that fairy tales described centuries ago, and Victorian Britain documented with terrible precision and that persists still in forms we often refuse to see. The tales were never just stories, they were always truth.